Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us this afternoon for another ABLA webcast. My name is Kate Thompson, and I'm an Associate Director in our Newcastle office. And with me today, I have Alana Rafter, who's a Senior Associate in our Sydney office. Today, Alana, we're going to be talking about what I would say, I'm not overstating it if I call it the vexed question or the vexed topic of psychosocial hazards. So I think, if we're going to give people a little bit of a rundown before we kick off about where we're going to end up, can you tell me, are you going to make my life easier if I'm sitting there as a viewer today, or are you going to make things more complicated and harder?
100%. The entire mission of today is to make psychosocial hazard a simple word.
Thank goodness.
A happy concept.
Lovely. Let's. And how are you going to do that for us today?
So we're going to set that out right from the start. We're going to explain in simple terms what it is. Then we're going to do what most of you had registered for this webcast for, which is what are my obligations?
That's right. That's the money topic, isn't it?
And the most important obligation we have is risk management. So that's going to be the major focus of today. So we're going to go through how you identify psychosocial hazards, how you assess the risks arising from them, how do you implement control measures, review them, and then at the end of all that, we're going to go through as many questions as we can. So you're welcome to keep sending questions throughout this webcast. And thank you for everyone that registered with questions. So we've incorporated psychosocial hazard myself.
Yeah.
Incorporated as many questions as we can throughout, and hopefully I will keep my voice.
And hopefully I'll be able to drive the iPad. So we're living on a prayer at the moment. So you told me, Alana, and you've told everyone sitting there listening that you're going to make psychosocial hazards simple. Psychosocial is a big word. I can hardly say it half the time, which is probably saying more about me than the word. But anyway, let's push through that. So give us the Idiot's Guide to Psychosocial Hazards. What does it mean? What are we worrying about?
Okay, well, let's just break the myth. It's not a complicated hidden hazard that you know nothing about. I'm sure you actually know a lot about it because it's so common. It's practically everywhere you look at work. So it's the hazard that's caused by the way we work. It arises in the way work's managed. It arises from the work environment, from the equipment, and the way workers behave. And what this hazard does is it typically creates stress, and that stress is what then might cause psychological harm or physical harm as well.
So are you saying to me that we need to be eliminating stress from our workplaces? Because, speaking for our own selves, I'm not sure that lawyers are particularly good people to talk about the elimination of stress.
Okay, that's exactly what I'm not saying.
Excellent,
Kate.
great.
Yes, no workplace has the obligation to 100% eliminate stress. If you could, you would be achieving the impossible because life's stressful, work's stressful, getting constructive feedback is stressful. So that's nobody's job at the workplace to remove all that stress. What I want you to do, though, when you see stress, treat it as the signal.
Right. Early warning signal.
Yeah, like the yellow light in our traffic light system of, is everything okay here with the way I'm managing work? Is everything okay here with the work design, with the equipment? Is this stress something to be worried about? Because at the end of the day, too much stress, excessive, unreasonable stress, that's where you fall into the territory of you're risking psychological harm or injury.
Sure. And I think as well, a lot of the people watching the webcast today probably have seen the workers' compensation medical certificate saying stress as the diagnosis, which, we're not going to stray into that territory today because we'd be here all day and no one really wants that. So basically what you're saying is don't be concerned about the fact that we've got stress per se. Be concerned about what the stress might be hiding or suggesting and take some steps in relation to looking a little bit deeper. Okay, well, let's talk about our legal obligations because we are lawyers. That's why we're here. That's why we get paid the big bucks. Not sure that that's the case, but anyway. So let's talk legal obligations. I'm hoping, again, you're going to further simplify what we're talking about today and tell me it's already stuff I already know. Is that right?
Exactly again.
Amazing.
So all those bullet points you can see on the slide, I hope they look incredibly familiar. If they don't look familiar, that maybe be a conversation we need to have after the webcast. But these are the exact same duties that apply to physical hazards. So we're in the familiar zone again.
Yep. So physical hazards, trip hazards, chemicals, traffic management, those kinds of things. Same approach to psychological hazards.
That's right. And I like that you describe them as psychological hazards, because psychosocial hazards the big thing they cause is psychological harm. And that's what we see in that first bullet point there. You have to ensure the health and safety of workers, and that health includes psychological health.
So that first dot point is really the same obligation that we have for safety generally. So exactly. We're just applying the same framework that we'd be hopefully very familiar with to this different paradigm of harm and hazards. Is that right?
That's right.
Great. Okay. So understand my duty. What's the next thing I need to do?
Okay, now you know your duty. You have to manage the risks. And that's, again, by seeking to eliminate or minimize the risks so far as reasonably practicable. And now what that requires is proactive action. So what we don't want you to be doing with psychosocial hazards is waiting for the psychological harm to occur and being like, we should do something about this.
So that's the workers' comp certificate ending up on my desk, potentially.
What we want you to do, and what this obligation is, you need to take steps before the harm even gets to that point. And that's why we have to manage the risks. And that's how you protect and ensure the health and safety of your workers. So lots of overlap with these duties.
Okay. So third dot point there, I can see the word consultation. Depending on your personality and your management style, that's either a great word or a really scary word. Does that mean I use my existing work health safety consultative committee? Does it mean I have to set one up? What do you suggest?
Well, if you already have a WHS committee or health safety representatives, great, use them. You don't have to throw out existing processes with this. You can incorporate them. But again, if you don't have that formal level of consultation, you don't need to set it up either. You can just have conversations with your workers, regular check-ins about safety throughout the week or at a meeting. It can be as formal as you like, but you don't have to have this formal system to tick the box for consultation.
So what I'm starting to hear you say is a little bit of what I imagine is probably a little bit of a balm to some of our smaller to medium businesses who might be watching us today, which is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to go, to that next stage of having the greatest, most whiz-bang policies, procedures, mechanisms, all those kinds of things. What might be appropriate for your workplace might be indeed a very casual, conversation-based, observation-based system of consultation. Is that fair to say?
That's right, because safety is not meant for the select few. Safety is meant to be accessible for all. Every business should be able to implement safety measures that suits their capabilities and protects their workers and others on their workplace.
Great. All right, last point there, provide information, training and instruction. So do we extend that theme on then and go, well, depending on the nature of our business, the size, the hazards that our workers are going to face will depend on what we actually need to do to discharge that obligation?
Again, that's exactly what it will do. And I keep saying exactly and agreeing to everything you're saying today, but it is this simple, because you're adjusting things to the needs of your workplace. So some workplaces might think face-to-face training is the way to ensure their workers are best prepared. For smaller operations, maybe online training or even just providing information will be enough, because what you're trying to do with this final duty of providing information, training and instruction, you're trying to ensure your workers are safe. You're giving them the tools and information so your workers know what they're doing, know how to identify a hazard, know the control measures you've put in place to protect them. So that's all about making sure they're aware what to do to stay safe. And then consultation, just to show a bit of contrast, that's really just including them in the conversation and giving them a chance to be heard.
Okay, well, this is all sounding pretty familiar. I'm pretty comfortable with all of this so far. So if we take away from all of that, basically we're extending out, we're not displacing our existing obligations. We're maybe just changing our understanding of the nature and scope of those obligations. Is that fair to say?
Making sure that you don't put psychological harm to the side, include it as part of physical harm, etc.
But of course, we wouldn't be here unless something had changed. So let's talk about what it is and the reason why we're here. And I think, if we summarize the reason why we're here, it's because there's been an increasing focus on this area, not only because of, I want to make some quips about workers' compensation claims, but also increasing legislative and regulator focus. So tell us exactly why that's arisen.
That's right. Back in 2018, the existing WHS legislation was reviewed. And one of the outcomes of that process was that psychological harm, in particular psychosocial hazards and risks, was just not getting enough attention. So what happened in 2022 is Safe Work Australia updated the model law. So they introduced a model regulation that specifically targeted psychosocial hazards. They also introduced a model code of practice for managing psychosocial hazards in the workplace. And since that time, different states and territories have introduced regulation and codes of practices that expressly address psychosocial hazards. So the states we have that have done that, and New South Wales, WA, Queensland, and we even have the Northern Territory. They have all introduced it.
Forget about our friends in Tasmania either.
Oh, that's right. Sorry, Tasmania.
Left off the map, left off our list. Okay, so you talked about the model there. So, and then we've named off some jurisdictions where we've seen some concrete legislative and regulatory change as well. What about our friends in Victoria, SA and the ACT?
Oh, that's right. So Victoria are currently considering psychological harm regulations. So they're under consideration by the government, but not yet in force. The other states have yet to take action in this space. Doesn't mean that everyone that's tuning in from South Australia and ACT can tune out now. No need to learn about psychosocial risk management, because as we said at the outset, that duty to ensure psychological health and safety, that applies nationally.
Sure. Okay. So I think one of the other things that I picked up when we were having a look at some of this stuff and some of the conversations we've been having with our clients is not only is there sort of a now enforced focus on psychosocial hazards as a particular area of management when you think about your work health safety framework generally, there's been a slight change in how we're actually going to go about controlling some of those risks that arise from those hazards. Hopefully everyone, we're making some assumptions here, but hopefully everyone on the webcast today is familiar with the idea of the hierarchy of controls. So once we've gone through the process of identifying our risks, which we'll talk about in a moment, we then approach our control measures by applying the hierarchy of controls. But I think in some of this increasing regulatory focus and change, we've seen a little bit of a shift away from the hierarchy of controls. Would you say that, or are we augmenting? How are we dealing with the hierarchy of controls?
I'm with you on shifting away, because there is a little bit of an overlap. But what's happening with these states and territories that have introduced this new regulation? The safety regulators have effectively said, you know what, for psychosocial hazards, the process of selecting and implementing control measures to manage those risks requires a little bit of a different approach. It's not a matter of going, let's eliminate, substitute, and introduce some admin controls and maybe PPE. For psychosocial hazards, they're saying, no, we need to consider a variety of factors. And these factors are the design of work, the systems of work, like your policies, procedures, practices, the physical workplace, and we'll go into more a bit later when we turn to controls. But what you're doing with these factors is you're asking, what can I change or modify there to better minimize or eliminate the risk of harm? And so that's the change for psychosocial hazards. The considerations you need to consider have just expanded.
So a little bit more of a nuanced approach than perhaps we're used to with our physical hazards. Okay, all right. Let's then start off, talk about risk management, shall we? Because I think, we can't talk about this topic without actually giving people a little bit of a step-by-step guide to what are we worrying about, what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to keep monitoring the fact that monitoring our success in doing something about it or not, as the case might be. Let's hope not after this webcast. But so I like the graphic here. Talk to us about what that actually summarises.
So what you can see on that graphic, which is taken from the New South Wales Code of Practice for Managing Psychosocial Hazards, is the risk management process. And it just consists of 4 simple steps. Identify the hazards, assess the risks, control those risks with control measures. And because it's a system, we've got to be reviewing those control measures. So this isn't a process of step 1, 2, 3, done. It's an ongoing process, and we'll touch on that a bit more later as well.
I also am going to hold you to the fact that you said it was a simple process because I suspect there's some people in our audience today who probably wouldn't be joining us if they agreed that it was indeed a simple process. So you've got on that side as well, Alana, and I think we bang on about this as lawyers, whether it's an employment IR issue or a safety issue. We're still talking about consultation throughout all of these processes, aren't we? And I think that's really important to emphasise.
That's right. And again, it doesn't need to be committees established. It can be as simple as just keeping your workers in the conversation, seeking feedback or comment, and just keeping them updated.
All right. Well, let's start at the very beginning. Very good place to start, as they say, with our hazard identification step. So talk us through some of the hazards. I think this is possibly somewhere where people are getting a little bit lost and confused about when we're talking about psychosocial hazards, exactly what are we talking about?
Yeah, so this is where we're talking about where I said you need to look at how the work is being managed, the equipment, etc. That's where these hazards are popping up. But that's a bit much without examples. So what we're going to do on that slide, you can see a whole host of common psychosocial hazards that exist in the workplace. Now, a gateway into psychosocial hazards, if that word is just too technical, annoying, don't like it, throw it away, it's fine. You can refer to it as mental health hazards, psychological hazards, because the main harm that these hazards cause and the most significant harm they can cause is psychological harm. It may sometimes also have the physical harm, but psychological harm is the big thing we're trying to avoid and minimize.
Great. I like that way of talking about it as mental health hazards because I think that gives us a really clear, easily accessible understanding of what exactly we're talking about. I think there's some really interesting ones on this slide though. So pick a couple, any couple, and talk to us about your favourite few.
I think the one that everyone should know about right now is working remote. So since the pandemic, most of our clients and many businesses have adjusted their work practices such that some workers are working from home maybe Monday and Friday, in the office Tuesday to Thursday, or it's just a flexible program where you can pick and choose. Nice office to work in. Or maybe it's you've got workers that are permanently working from home. Well, that is a very common psychosocial hazard right there. And the risk we can see is that that worker is in isolation. And that's the isolation, that design of work, that's what's creating the hazard that might risk psychological harm if you took no steps to do anything about it. So that's one example.
What about sexual harassment? I think we've been doing, and anyone who's on our mailing list and who joins us for these webcasts regularly would have seen my face up here talking about sexual harassment.
That's why I'm leaving it to you to talk about it.
A couple of months ago. But sexual harassment and bullying, I think, are really important ones. Probably the two on that slide that have the most negative press or are the most familiar with some of our viewers. So, you know, if we talk about psychosocial risks and hazards, you know, let's think about things like, you know, interpersonal conflict, harassment, bullying. We've got workplace conflict up there on the list as well. You know, I think probably fair to say people understand, they conceptualize those things as potentially causing people mental health harm. Another one up there that I was really surprised to see was low workload. So you talked before about, you know, people feeling isolated, people working remotely, perhaps not having that connection to the workplace that we previously had. I think some people would say low workload would be a good thing, not a hazardous thing. So how does that kind of play out?
For some workers, low workload could be the dream, but it is a hazard you need to be aware of. So this is where your employee or worker may not have enough to do to fill their day. It could also take the form of you're not using their full capacity or qualifications. They've been hired for a particular job. None of that's available for them to do. And so that can lead to some dissatisfaction and potential or worse. So it very much is the flip side of high workload. But you've got to be aware that both can be hazards in the workplace.
Sure. What about another low and not a high, low job control? What do you mean by that?
Low job control. The simplest example is micromanaging your workers. So picture someone over their shoulder, not letting them do anything without the say of the manager, supervisor, not letting them comment, not letting them give feedback or suggestions, a very restrictive workplace. And you can see how, especially when I describe it in that way, that it might lead to psychological harm.
So what I'm seeing there is maybe two broad categories. So people issues, if we put it into that bucket, our bullying, harassment, those kinds of things. And then perhaps process issues or design issues. So things like low workload, low job control. You can see up there as well things like exposure to traumatic materials. So, you know, in some workplaces, and we will talk about this in a moment when we're talking about how to manage some of the risks that are going to arise from these hazards. Ultimately, you know, despite our best endeavours, we may not always be able to do anything about removing some of the hazards and the risks that they cause. And I think maybe exposure to traumatic material falls into that category for some workers, doesn't it? So, all right, there's some examples. Mental health hazards, I like it. Let's talk about hazard identification in a little bit more detail. So how else are we working through in our workplaces, identifying the particular hazards that we need to worry about?
So here is where I know a lot of people get a bit worried about how am I meant to be identifying them. And a lot of it is simple things. So observation in your workplace. So taking the time to just see how the work is being performed and maybe asking questions like, are my workers using the equipment correctly? Are they following policies or procedures we've set up? So observations like that, which can give you some insight into whether are there areas I should be looking into that might cause psychosocial hazards. And also, I'm going to say it again, and will probably annoy everyone listening with this, chatting with your workers, consulting with them, because they will have such fantastic insight about how the work's being performed, what's potentially hindering them or helping them in the workplace. So don't ignore them, include them in this conversation because they might know some stuff you didn't even think about because they have a different perspective to management.
So what I like about this approach to hazard identification is the fact that, you know, and we have a lot of conversations with our clients who might be from small and medium-sized enterprises, and they sort of say to us, look, this is all very hard. We don't have the resources. We don't have the expertise. But what I'm kind of taking away from some of this discussion is if you are indeed, you know, one of those smaller businesses, you might be better placed to some extent to actually identify your hazards because you have that closer connection to what's happening on the ground. We've also had a question come through about exposure to traumatic material when working in particular types of services. So if you're working in the care space, you know, health professionals, support services, domestic violence services, those kinds of things. Will we talk a little bit more about managing those risks that arise from those hazards as we move on? But in particular, do you think that there's any way of entirely eliminating these hazards? I think I mentioned that before. Probably not is the answer, I'm going to guess.
It's the ideal. So, of course, the duty says eliminate because that's the ideal standard. If we could have a hazard-free workplace, that would be amazing. But in most cases, minimization is the best you can do, and that's why the standard is so high. You've got to try and minimize as much as possible.
Okay, great. All right, so I think one more thing that we might just touch on before we move on is this idea that if I don't have anyone telling me there's any problems, I don't have any problems. Do you think that's a fair assessment, or are we maybe mischaracterizing?
That's right. If your employees aren't reporting any psychosocial hazards in the workplace, you can just relax. No psychosocial hazards there. You're done. Unfortunately, no. And that's an important thing to take away. Low reporting about hazards, and that applies for physical hazards too, doesn't mean you're in the clear. It might actually be an indicator that potentially your workers don't know enough about psychosocial hazards. Maybe they need some more information to be able to identify them. It could also mean maybe you should look at your reporting system, or do you have a a system such as a complaints box, an incident box, or encourage your workers to communicate to supervisors concerns or issues they identify.
So just because there's no complaints, no data, no incident reporting doesn't mean I have no problems.
No, definitely not. Unfortunately, sorry.
Oh, goodness. Okay, just creating more problems for everyone on a Tuesday afternoon. All right, so we've worked out what the hazards are. We've gone through that process either in a very formal way or in a less formal way, depending on the needs of the business, the time that we have available to us, the urgency. What's the next step?
Now we come to assessment, assessing those risks. And this is one of those requirements that you can't avoid. So you've identified them. Don't skip ahead and just implement things you might think will address risks. You need to take a step, take stock, and assess the seriousness of these risks.
So what does that mean? So I've gone through and I've worked out all of my hazards. I've gone, well, they're all very serious, Alana. What do I do about them? How do I kind of break that down into a more useful process?
So I want to tack onto that a question we did receive with the registrations, which was someone said, how do we measure duration, frequency, and severity? So those are the factors that we often use to assess risks. So what measurement am I using? So don't complicate this. There's no specific prescribed metric you have to apply. I like to use a very simple scale because if it's simple, you're going to do it, quite frankly. So the scale is low, medium, high. Is it low frequency? Is it medium frequency? Is it high frequency? Is it happening daily, annually? So these are the ways you're assessing it. And with seriousness of harm, is it going to be minimal harm or potentially no harm at all? Or if the risk arises and happens, is significant medical intervention going to be needed?
Okay.
If it's the latter, we're definitely entering in the high territory of this is a significant risk.
So let's talk through a couple of examples then, because I think the hazard identification, probably everyone feels relatively comfortable with that. It's this more forensic stage of risk assessment or assessing the things that you just talked about, so severity, duration, and frequency, that people start to get a little bit confused about. So let's start off with maybe a low-key or a more low-key example. So what about someone who's having a low workload situation? Because I liked that one from the previous slide.
Okay, the situation I can think about is when I was working as a wait staff back in the day in the hospitality industry as a teenager, first job. So the worst shift, or best shift, depending on your kind of worker, was that lull between the lunch rush and the dinner shift. So you had a few hours there where there could potentially be an hour or so of just nothing to do.
No one in the restaurant.
So you could be texting on your phone, or you might be using your initiative to do stuff and figure out things to do. But that's a scenario where low workload can happen. It could be because I don't know much about what I should be doing in those times, or maybe there just frankly is nothing to do because everything's already done. So if I was to assess that risk, I would be going, okay, that if we do nothing about that, if we let that slide and let the low workload just continue, I should say, realistically, the harm's low. For that scenario,
I'm just going to be bored.
It's quite low.
Yep.
Bored or happy that you don't have anything to
As
do.
the case may be, yes.
Then now the frequency of that hazard, maybe it's every afternoon shift. So maybe medium frequency, high frequency. The duration of it, an hour or so. Again, maybe we're more on the medium scale of that. It's not that much, an hour or so of a shift. But so I've assessed that as a low risk, but it's happening quite a lot.
Okay.
That's my assessment right there.
So if we just skip ahead for a second, that might be something which we go, you know what, there might be some control measures we can think about for that, but they're probably not going to be high on our list of priorities when we're looking at all of the other things we need to be concerned with.
So you're not going to ignore it, but in our list, we're probably going to put that in lower priority. And I think, Kate, you've got an example which is going to attract a lot more priority.
Yeah, and I think this one's come about because, you know, we're lucky enough to work with a lot of clients in the disability services sector at ABLA, doing very, very important work, but indeed very challenging work. I don't think anyone's going to quarrel with that characterisation. As I mentioned before, we've been doing a lot of work on sexual harassment because we have got a new positive duty to prevent or eliminate sexual harassment. So just adding into the duty pile-on for employers. But one of the questions that's come up quite a few times is if our employees are working with participants with highly sexualized behaviours, how do we manage that risk? There's obviously quite a significant, if we draw a characterization differential with your example, Alana, probably much more significant potential outcomes there. So how do we characterize, how do we work through the risk assessment of that particular hazard? So I think if we're thinking about severity, let's start there. Potentially very significant. If I've got a worker going into someone's private residence or into a group home, being exposed to a participant with those kinds of behaviours, potentially very significant consequences for that person if I haven't put the appropriate control measures in place. Duration, well, again, probably for the length of the service potentially, or the length of time that person's spending in that residence with that person. So, probably a medium high rating on the duration scale. And frequency, of course, will depend on, how often does that person exhibit those behaviours? How often are we sending that particular employee into that environment to be spending time with or providing services to that participant? So I think, if we think about severity, duration, and frequency in that example, I'm thinking probably, relatively high on all three counts. So probably if we're thinking about, the priority list as an employer, that would be one of those ones that's up there. And like we were saying before, with exposure to traumatic materials and those sorts of things, probably something that ultimately we can't do that much about. We can't eliminate in the same way that we would if we were applying the hierarchy of controls in that traditional way, because that's part of the nature of the work that we're performing. So we've assessed the risk, we know it's a problem. What do we do from here?
And that's why we go to control measures, the next step. So as Kate said, we need to eliminate and minimize so far as reasonably practicable. So this is where you're trying to select the most effective control measures. Now, on the slide there, you should see a series of factors. These are those factors we referred to at the outset. These are the new things that have been inserted into the psychosocial regulation. And these factors, they're effectively going to help you brainstorm with your team a range of control measures that might help you minimize the risk.
So this is what we use instead of or in addition to the hierarchy of controls.
That's right. You're going to be looking at these factors and trying to choose the most effective combination. Now, with the hierarchy of controls, sometimes you might find the best control measure that can just eliminate it or substitute it, job done. Psychosocial hazards, bit different. You very often will need a combination of control measures. So that, for example, we'll stick with sexual harassment. So the control measures that you might do, looking at the facts on there, are for systems of work, you might update your policies. So sexual harassment, the law's changed and been updated, so you need to make sure your policy is up to date. Or for some of you, you might want to consider implementing a new policy or a written policy. And along with that, a good control measure combination would be training.
Yep.
Perhaps you want to provide face-to-face positive duty training for your managers and leaders, maybe some online training and information for your workers. And so that's an example of a combination that you might do. And related to the trauma question, you might want to consider vicarious trauma. If your workers are exposed to potentially traumatic material, a common control is to give them vicarious training so that the workers are aware that it's a risk in their job and that they feel empowered and have knowledge to do something, to take steps to protect themselves. So that's another control measure you might do there for that one.
So what about things like systems of work and physical workplace? Because I think when we start to talk about psychosocial hazards, we're thinking about very much in the mental health space because, we said before we can think about them as mental health hazards. I'm interested to see there, we're still talking about physical things as well and the way people are going about that work. Tell us more about how those things can have an effective control impact on some of these risks.
So for systems of work or design of work, which one were?
Look, let's start with physical workplace because I find that one really interesting.
Yes, physical workplace. Apologies, lots of these factors running through my head. So for the physical workplace, this can be really simple checks and might help with a lot of your hazard management. So for example, are there safe exits and entries in your office space for your workers? Because if that's not there, that can contribute to a lot of the common hazards we talked about before. but also simple steps like making sure your workers have access to facilities like toilet facilities, a kitchen, basic things like that, which you most likely already provide in your workplace, or most of you, if you have offices, have those going.
Sure.
And other factors could be the lighting in your workplace. If all the lighting's gone out, that can contribute to psychosocial hazards. It probably will make your workers feel like they're getting a bit of poor support from their managers if you're not replacing the lights. But that's how physical workplace changes might occur to address psychosocial hazards.
Let's talk about systems and design of work then as well, because I think if we take our sexual harassment example, that would be one of the things that I would be saying, well, let's have a think about the way that we're actually designing our work structures. So in that example, can we think about making sure that we're sending out 2 people perhaps to provide those services? Is that something which is reasonably practicable? The answer to that might be no, but let's not jump to the assumption of saying no before we even give it some consideration. What are some other examples of design of work or systems of work that we might want to have a think about in this space?
Well, for design of work, you're very much asking questions. How can I change or modify the role or the task? And also more staff is another option. But systems of work, that's one that we get a lot of questions about because it just sounds very intimidating. I like to scrap just referring to it as systems of work and just say it's your policies, your procedures, your rules and your practices in the workplace. So there is a bit of a written element of like the rules and policies, what you're doing there, what changes you can make as to how you want things to be. But then there's the related concept of how it's happening in practice. What are your workers doing? What support can you provide there to make sure and help employees to be working consistently with these policies, if that's your control you're implementing?
We've got a couple of questions, so we might throw to those just really quickly. Interesting one here, and I don't know the answer to this. I'll be interested to see whether you do. Are there any examples of PPE as a control measure for psychosocial hazards?
I would say PPE does count as a control for psychosocial hazards, particularly in COVID. If I can go back, I have to go to masks. So the masks will address the physical hazard as well of like potential exposure back in the day, with transmission being a very big safety concern. But there is also the related psychosocial hazard there of workers feeling that they might get sick at work, that they might catch COVID. So providing that equipment as part of the work, so it's related to the design and also practice of your workplace, that can help put that worker at ease and minimize their worry with respect to their exposure. It might not be the only thing you could do, but that's an example in which PPE might count as a control for psychosocial hazard risk management too.
What you're saying there really is, yes, potentially PPE might be an example, but it's going to depend on the nature of the hazard that we're actually talking about. Great answer. Thank you for picking me up there where I was falling down. Interesting question here. So how can we assess risk and possible harm when every individual's personal profile and life stresses will also have an impact on how they cope with work? So that question of how much am I responsible? How much do I have to have regard to someone's personal circumstances, personal vulnerability when I'm actually assessing risk, and then also determining appropriate control measures?
So a nice, simple question. No. So I find that's a very complicated thing that can overlap with workers' compensation, all that, but we'll put that all aside. So if you have workers that have disclosed their pre-existing conditions, you can't just ignore that. You have to take
Once
steps.
you know, you've got to do something about it.
So, and that's actually a step you would take way back when you're identifying hazards. So if a worker's told you they have a particular vulnerability, you should be taking steps and might need to introduce some additional control measures for them. Now, related to that, and this might be a conversation for another day, is anti-discrimination related obligations. They will overlap in that space.
So making sure we're not treating people differently because they've made those disclosures.
So there's things that you might need to double check and ask us, we'll help you out. But yes, so you can't just ignore them. You have to do something about that.
So bad news is for that questioner, I think, long story short, you do have to have regard to people's personal circumstances. Just because things are happening outside of work, because there might be a particular vulnerability for that person, doesn't mean it's not my problem as their employer.
But a related concern I think we should also address is the concern of when you're giving constructive feedback and if someone might take it the wrong way. And that's a risk that can happen. But the thing you're doing with these control measures, as Kate and I have both said, you can't eliminate the risk. You can't eliminate that someone might take negative feedback the really wrong way and it might hurt their feelings or more. But what you're doing is, as long as you're supporting your design of work with processes, for example, there's a personal grievance policy, there's a process for when managers are giving feedback, managers are trained on how they should be giving
we've
feedback.
actually given those managers some instruction about how to deliver that message.
So you've taken those steps, and that's how you're meeting your safety obligation in this space. You're implementing these controls. So if the hazard does arise, you've taken all the steps you could possibly do to minimize it, or reasonably practicably do to minimize it. You're in a good space in the safety zone.
So I think that's a really good point you're making there, Alana, which is to say that ultimately we can do as much as we can, but in a lot of these circumstances, we're going to unfortunately have to deal with the outcome or the manifestation of these hazards and the risks that they cause. So we can't stop it. So let's think about the things we can do to minimize that harm, both from a caring perspective of making sure that we've done as much as we can for our employees to reduce the impact on them of some of these things happening, but also so if the regulator comes knocking, we can say, well, it was very unfortunate that these things happened, but here's all the great measures that I put in place to try and minimize that risk or minimize the harm that arose. So bit of a downer there, really, just admitting that we can't control everything. So let's talk about effective control measures then for a moment. What is an effective control measure? Because we've spoken a little bit about now some examples of some control measures. How do I work out if it's actually going to be any good?
Yeah. So when you're testing to see if your control measures are effective, you're looking for these three factors: that they're fit for purpose, that they're suitable for the nature and duration of the work, and that they're installed, set up, and used correctly. A control measure that's not being used correctly is not going to do much good now, is it? So it's a bit of common sense here, but why you need to make sure you have effective control measures is because you also have a duty to maintain them. So it's not a matter that I said to implement it and then forget about it. You have to make sure it's maintained and it remains to be effective throughout.
Sure. Okay. So that sounds great. I'm a small business person, theoretically. Do I have to have the same expectations put upon me as my colleagues who work in much bigger businesses with much more resources? How does that play into determining whether a control measure is effective or not?
So a lot of that will determine. So I think we're starting to edge more closer into the have I minimized it so far as reasonably practicable with that question.
Okay, right. So if I'm thinking about what's reasonably practicable, I think a lot of people go straight to the bottom point there, which is cost. How much is it going to cost me? And therefore, is it reasonably practicable? But I think that's a far too simplistic understanding of what reasonably practicable involves, and is really putting the cart before the horse, isn't it? Because before we even get to working out, is it going to be too expensive, we need to do the process that's sort of stepped through on those 4 dot points there. So firstly, let's think about the likelihood and the severity of the harm. So I'm going to have to put more effort into doing something about a harm or a risk that's going to be quite serious. If it's very likely, obviously going to be higher up my list of priorities than something which is less likely. We then accept that, we've characterized it in that way. We then actually have to think about, well, what am I going to do about it? Is there actually any way of doing anything effective to control that risk? Because, we've been talking a lot about today, characterizing these things as mental health risks. It might be that some professions, some jobs, some of the things that we need to do are inherently risky. So can I really do that much about it? The answer might be, in some cases, possibly not. And, is it the case that even if there is a control measure available to me, is it going to be suitable? Is it going to be accessible? And then finally, once we've gone through all of that process, we turn to think about the cost. So if I've gone through that process, I know it's a problem, I know there's something I can do, I then turn to consideration of, well, is it going to send me broke if I actually put that control measure in place. So if we go back to the example we were using before of the disability services provider, it might indeed be too costly for that person to send out 2 staff members to perform all of those services. So that might be something which, in an ideal world, yes, absolutely, that would be our preferred control measure. But if we're having regard to what's reasonably practicable, the answer is ultimately no, unfortunately not. All right, so we've worked out what we're going to do, and you said, though, that I have to keep monitoring. So it's not a set and forget situation is what I'm taking away from this. Just a lot of work, really, Alana, isn't it?
It's a lot of work, but a simple thing, those steps, identifying, assessing, controlling, reviewing. The reviewing is so important because your duty is to ensure health and safety. So that's why you need to incorporate review. And I like to break it down into 2 key types of review. You should have your routine review. So this could be you've selected your control measures and you've decided, you know what, annually on this date, we're going to review it. We're going to check that they're effective, and we're going to ask, is there more we could do to minimize the risks, or are the control measures actually not doing enough or doing what they should be doing? So that's what you should be doing routinely. For some control measures, you might say we need to check it quarterly. For a lot, annually might be sufficient.
So you've spoken there about potentially having a structure or a routine in place. Is there other circumstances or other prompts that we might need to have regard to when thinking about reviewing our control measures?
Yes, and that's those last dot points you see on there. These are different events that trigger an additional review. So even if you have your annual review, if you see a control measure is not effective or working well, you still have to look into it. You need to review it and see what can be done to improve it or remedy that situation. If one of your workers identifies a hazard, you may need to do a risk assessment again. They've identified this hazard, assess the risks, consider control measures, and then start a review process for this new control measure. Or if you have a health safety representative. So for those businesses that have a more formal consultation process
already in place,
they might request you to conduct a review. And if that happens, you're obligated to conduct a review.
One of our, if we go back to our physical safety mindset for a moment, one of the things that we commonly do in that context is do a post-incident review. Is that appropriate here? What would you suggest some of those incidents would be that might actually prompt us to have a think about our control measures and determine whether they're still adequate?
I think a simple way of checking control measures is, and I'm going to say it again, chatting with your workers. Consultation is a very good way because say you have put a policy in place, a great thing to check is, do your employees know that it exists? If they say, yeah, it's somewhere on the intranet,
or in that folder in the crib room.
I'm sure we have one. I'm sure there is one. That's probably a sign we might need to take some additional steps with that one. Great policy might be the world's best policy, but maybe we need to take some additional steps to ensure employees are aware of it and know what it's about. So that's where you might think I might need to consider some additional training or information there.
What about where we're thinking about doing things a bit differently? So, for example, let's go back to our remote working hazard or the potential hazards associated with remote working. So say I've had people working remotely for 3 or so years now, and I'm about to tell them they need to come back into the office for a certain number of days per week. Do you think that would be an appropriate time to have a think about what are my control measures I've got in place already? Hopefully there's some. And as a secondary consideration to that, maybe this is an opportunity to have a think about some new or different control measures.
Yes, you definitely need to think about both of those things that Kate said, and also very much need to involve that worker in the conversation before that big change occurs. So you wouldn't just go, okay, you're in the office from Monday, no more, just stop working from home. So if you're going to implement this big change, you need to do an assessment and think about the risks that might arrive there, because that's a major change for that worker having had a routine of 3 years at home.
Yep.
But you also got to engage them in consultation about it because it might have some safety issues, psychosocial hazards arising there as well.
So I think if we have a summary of all of that, there's a couple of different prompts that probably cause us to undertake a review. So it might be time-based. So let's give it 6 months and see how things are happening. It might be quarterly. It might be per our meeting schedule for our HSR committee. It might be post-incident or post issue arising. You might have a particular, traumatic event happen in the workplace. You might have a wave of workers' compensation claims, use that as our prompt. And then finally, as well, as you said a number of times now, Alana, just talking to people, if people are telling you things don't seem quite right, or you're picking up on that vibe, that might be your opportunity to undertake one of these reviews as well. Couple of questions before we move on. I think this one's really interesting. Just going to throw a couple of curly ones at you. Do you think that checking or asking some questions about people's psychological health before putting them in a high-risk situation is a control? So perhaps undertaking some pre-employment psychological assessments, those kinds of things. What's the view on that?
Putting aside additional privacy things that might arise there as well, if we break it down to just asking questions of how people feel about this task they're going to undertake. So if we take a common one, working from heights, so are you comfortable working from heights? There's obviously some physical hazards there, but there could be some related psychosocial hazards there too. What if the person has a complete fear of heights and don't want to be put in that situation? Now, they might not know that until they're up there, but yeah, having that conversation, I think checking in before people do certain tasks, that can be a great way.
So I think what you're saying there as well, Alana, correct me if I'm wrong, is we do need to, as we said before, unfortunately, have some regard to people's personal circumstances. So it might be asking the question, working out whether or not someone is well suited to working in a particular environment before putting them in that environment might be one of our control measures. I think, if we think back to, we were talking about sexual harassment and some of the approaches that we take to managing our risk and discharging our positive duty, that's one of the things that we talk about in that context as well. So you might have particular people in your workplace who are vulnerable or have particular life experiences that put them at particular risk of harm, in the same way that their colleague, at the next desk might not have the same likelihood for. So if you don't ask the question, you can't make that determination, can you? So, but as you said previously as well, once you ask the question, we potentially need to navigate through that discrimination area quite carefully as well. Sometimes information is power, sometimes information is risk. All right. Another question before we move on, because I like this one as well. What are your options if you assess all control measures as not being reasonably practicable? What can we do then?
I'd very much challenge that if you can...
Nothing is reasonably practicable.
None of it.
Okay.
Telling people about the hazard, not reasonably practicable. Warning people as not... I find that a bit hard to believe. There's usually because there is a range of hazards. For that mindset, you might be thinking that control measures need to be costly, you need to put a lot of money.
Or that we need to eliminate, as you said before. And it might be that can't be our goal with some of this stuff.
Minimization. If you can't eliminate it, think, what could I do to minimize it? So would having a conversation with your worker be helpful? Because that's a control measure as well. It's not as glamorous as a policy, but regular check-ins with your workers is a common control measure. Lower measure, but a common cost-effective control measure for a lot of these psychosocial hazards.
So long story short, we challenge that questioner about their characterization, but thank you for the question. So we've talked a lot today, Alana, about trying to make things more simple, trying to give our viewers today some concrete steps. What else can we do for people who might be sitting there thinking, oh, this all sounds like a bit too much hard work?
Well, as we said at the outset, if you have an existing WHS risk management process or system, you don't need to throw it away. But if you're not sure if it's actually compliant or doing enough for psychosocial hazards and risks, we could review or update your existing process and just make sure it's all good. we also offer training, and this is where I'm going to throw it over to you, Kate, because this is your area.
This is my baby. On the 6th of September, we're introducing a new training course. You might be familiar with, hopefully you've already been along to some of our online training courses, so it doesn't matter where you are. You can join us for that one, which will give you some more sort of bespoke ideas, opportunity for discussion relating to some of the things that we've talked about today. So if you're sitting there going, oh, I think I need to upskill a little bit more in this area, that's your opportunity to do so. The other thing, and we're just doing a shameless plug now, let's be honest, that we've developed, which will be coming out shortly, is the psychosocial hazard templates that you've been working on, Alana. So if you're thinking, I need some help from a documentary perspective, I've got the knowledge framework already, I just need someone to give me the documents I can input the info into, that's going to be available soon as well. We have mentioned too, sexual harassment. If you don't already know that that's something you should be concerned with, then it is something you should be concerned with, both from a psychosocial hazards perspective, but also from a, we're going to have a new regulator in town. We do have the Sexual Harassment Positive Duty Toolkit, which is an amazing resource. So if you're looking at any of this stuff, thinking, okay, I need some help, we have lots of opportunities and information available to help you out as well. But I think on the next slide, Alana, you've given people some additional freebie resources in case you're thinking, oh my goodness, going away from today, I really need to get started. I don't know where to start. Tell us about this People at Work website.
Yes, if you'd like a deep dive into everything psychosocial, check out the People at Work website. So it is more of a comprehensive view. It's plugged as like a step-by-step thing, but there is a lot of information there. If you're a larger business or have a good team dedicated to WHS, you might want to set up an account there and have a play there and see if that's a tool that helps with your psychosocial risk assessment. Or if you just want to check out the resources there, they might just help you get a bit more familiar and some additional understanding as well. And then our favorite is the Code of Practice, Managing Psychosocial Hazards at Work. The New South Wales one has fantastic examples on the appendix to that again. So if you want to skip all the detail, just skip to the examples. They're quite helpful as well.
So, and the benefit of the codes of practice too in states like New South Wales, if we're doing the things that the code of practice says, we're going some way to discharging our duty if the regulator comes knocking. So a little bit of a tip there for you. So before we finish up today, a couple more questions I'd like to get your opinion on, Alana. So I'd be really interested to understand, we've talked a little bit about conflict today. When does a disagreement or when does an interpersonal conflict in the workplace actually become a hazard that I need to worry about, and not just people who don't get along?
That's the most common question we get. You have employee A that's got a gripe with employee B because they're not pulling their weight. When is that going to trigger and fall into our psychosocial hazard? It already is one. So that's falling into that broader category of workplace conflicts. So the question I would then ask is, well, that's a possible hazard for your workplace. If you have more than one person in your workplace conflict is a possibility.
Unfortunately.
So spoiler alert, if you have more than one, it's a possible hazard. But the next thing you're going to do is ask, well, what can I do about this hazard? So do you have a personal grievance policy? Do your employees know what to do if they are feeling a bit dissatisfied with another co-worker? Do your supervisors and managers know how they should be checking in with their staff or dealing with disagreements and things like this? So there's a combination of things you could do there. And the reason why we're taking all those steps is to stop that workplace disagreement, as small as it may be, escalating to a risky situation, which may put one or both of those workers at risk of psychological harm.
So basically, yes, it is my problem, yes. And I do need to do something about it. Right, lovely. Before we finish up, one last question. What are some tips you can give to us to encourage people to look at this as an opportunity rather than just something else they need to do to put on the endless to-do list for managers, particularly if you've got line managers or middle managers in your organisation who might be thinking, oh, not another thing.
My favorite tip will sound like a shameless plug again, but I very much find in psychosocial space that knowledge is power. And so if you can provide information and training to your managers so that they actually know psychosocial hazards aren't this intimidating thing they know nothing about, but make them feel comfortable about this group of hazards, knowing how to identify them, assess them, and control them, giving them that knowledge will help make them feel a lot more comfortable and confident in this space. Because I think a lot of the put it in the too hard basket is what's making people stand back.
And it's a little bit of lack of understanding, a little bit of discomfort that's putting it in that too hard basket. I think it's a really good segue before we finish up, just to remind everyone that the slides and the recording of today's webcast will be available. It'll be sent out to you next week and also be up on the website. So if you want to share some of these resources with your colleagues, feel free to do that. It might be a really good opportunity to open up that discussion in your workplace, start to act collaboratively and consultatively. I don't even know if that's a word, but we're going with it. Yep. In order to have a real think about psychosocial hazards and what you're doing. So hopefully today has been helpful and we've demystified the concept a little. Thank you very much, Alana, for being here with us today. And thanks everyone for joining us.